Hello and welcome everyone. This is a screencast-o-matic recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at the Scramble for Africa. Before we get started, please let me encourage you once again to open up to the correct part for today's lesson and to answer the key concept questions that correspond to certain sections of the textbook reading. Remember, you have this source uploaded to Google Classroom, and you can also replay this presentation for clarity or help if you need later. Let's go ahead and get started and learn more about the Scramble for Africa. First, let's set the stage. Industrialization stirred ambitions in many European nations, and they wanted more resources to fuel their industrial production. They competed for new networks anyway, for their goods, and many nations looked to Africa as a source of raw materials and as a market for industrial products. So as a result, colonial power seized vast areas of Africa during the 19th and early 20th centuries. This seizure of a country or a territory by a stronger country is called imperialism. As occurred throughout most of Africa, stronger countries dominated the political, economic, and social life of the weaker countries. Africa before European domination. In the mid-1800s, on the eve of the European domination of Africa, African peoples were divided into hundreds of ethnic and linguistic groups. Most continued to follow traditional beliefs, while others converted to Islam or Christianity. These groups spoke more than 1,000 different languages, and politically they ranged from large empires that united many ethnic groups to independent villages. So Europeans had established contacts with sub-Saharan Africans as early as the 1450s. However, powerful African armies were able to keep the Europeans out of most of Africa for 400 years. In fact, as late as 1880, Europeans controlled only 10% of the continent's land, mainly on the coast. Furthermore, European travel into the interior on a large-scale basis was virtually impossible. Europeans could not navigate African rivers, which had many rapids, cataracts, and changing flows. The introduction of steam-powered riverboats in the early 1800s allowed Europeans to conduct major expeditions into the interior of Africa. Disease also discouraged European exploration. Finally, Africans controlled their own trade networks and provided the trade items. These networks were specialized. The Chukwe, for example, devoted themselves to collecting ivory and beeswax in the Angolan highlands. Nations compete for overseas empires. Those Europeans who did penetrate the interior of Africa were explorers, missionaries, or humanitarians who opposed the European and American slave trade. Europeans and Americans learned about Africa through travel books and newspapers, and these publications competed for readers by hiring reporters to search the globe for stories for adventure, mystery, or excitement. The Congo sparks interest. In the late 1860s, David Livingstone, a missionary from Scotland, traveled with a group of Africans deep into Central Africa to promote Christianity. When several years passed with no word from him or his party, many people feared that he was dead. An American newspaper hired reporter Henry Stanley to find Livingstone, and in 1871 he found Dr. Livingstone on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. Stanley's famous greeting, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" made headlines around the world. So Stanley set out to explore Africa himself and trace the course of the Congo River. His exploration sparked the interest of King Leopold II of Belgium, who commissioned Stanley to help him obtain land in the Congo. Between 1879 and 1882, Stanley signed treaties with local chiefs of the Congo River Valley. The treaties gave King Leopold II of Belgium control of these lands. So Leopold claimed that his primary motive in establishing the colony was to abolish the slave trade and promote Christianity. However, he licensed companies that brutally exploited Africans by forcing them to collect sap from rubber plants. At least 10 million Congolese died due to the abuses inflicted during Leopold's rule. As a result of his cruelty, humanitarians around the world demanded changes. In 1908, the Belgian government took control of the colony away from Leopold. The Belgian Congo, as the colony later became known, was 80 times larger than Belgium. The Belgian government's seizure of Congo alarmed France. Earlier in 1882, the French had approved a treaty that gave France the north bank of the Congo River. Soon, Britain, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and Spain were also claiming parts of Africa. Forces driving imperialism. So the motives that drove colonization in Africa were also at work in other lands. Similar economic, political, and social forces accelerated the drive to take over land in all parts of the globe. The Industrial Revolution, in particular, provided European countries with the reason to add lands to their control. As European nations industrialized, they searched for new markets and raw materials to improve their economies. Belief in European superiority. The race for colonies also grew out of a strong sense of national pride. Europeans viewed an empire as a measure of national greatness. As the competition for colonies intensified, each country was determined to plant its flag on as much of the world as possible. So many Europeans believed that they were better than other peoples. The belief that one race is superior to others is called racism, and the attitude was a reflection of social Darwinism, a social theory of the time. And in this theory, Charles Darwin's ideas about evolution and natural selection were applied to human society too. Those who were fittest for survival enjoyed wealth and success and were considered superior to others. According to the theory, non-Europeans were considered to be on a lower scale of cultural and physical development because they had not made the scientific and technological progress that Europeans had. So Europeans believed that they had a right and a duty to bring the results of their progress to other countries. Cecil Rhodes, a successful businessman and a major supporter of British expansion, clearly stated this position. He says here, "I contend that we Britons are the first race in the world, and the more of our world that we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. It is our duty to seize every opportunity of acquiring more territory, and we should keep this one idea steadily before our eyes, that more territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, most honorable race the world possesses." So the push for expansion also came from missionaries who worked to convert the peoples of Asia, Africa, and the Pacific Islands to Christianity. Many missionaries believed that European rule was the best way to end evil practices such as the slave trade. They also wanted to, quote, civilize, end quote, that is, to westernize the peoples of the foreign land. Factors promoting imperialism in Africa. Several factors contributed to the Europeans' conquest of Africa. One overwhelming advantage was the Europeans' technological superiority. The Maxim gun, invented in 1884, was the world's first automatic machine gun, and European countries quickly acquired the Maxim, while the resisting Africans were forced to rely on outdated weapons. European countries also had the means to control their empire. The invention of the steam engine allowed Europeans to easily travel on rivers to establish bases of control deep in the African continent, and railroads, cables, steamships allowed close communications within a colony and between the colony and its controlling nation. Even the superior arms and steam engines to transport them, another factor, might have kept Europeans confined to the coast. They were highly susceptible to malaria, a disease carried by the dense swarms of mosquitoes in Africa's interior. The perfection of the drug quinine in 1829 eventually protected Europeans from becoming infected with the disease. Factors within Africa also made the continent easier for Europeans to colonize. Africans' huge variety of languages and cultures discouraged unity among them. Wars fought between ethnic groups over land, water, and trade rights also provided a unified stand. So Europeans soon learned to play rival groups against each other. The division of Africa. The scramble for Africa territory had begun in earnest about 1880. At the time, the French began to expand from the West African coast toward western Sudan. The discoveries of diamonds in 1867 and gold in 1886 in South Africa increased European interest in colonizing the continent. No European power wanted to be left out of that race. The Berlin Conference. So the competition was so fierce that European countries feared war among themselves. To prevent conflict, 14 European nations met at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to 1885 to lay down rules for the division of Africa. They agreed that any European country could claim land in Africa by notifying other nations of its claims and showing it could control that area. The European nations divided the continent with little thought about how Africa, ethnic or linguistic groups, were distributed, and no African ruler was invited to attend these meetings. Yet the conference sealed Africa's fate. By 1914, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained free from European control. Demand for raw materials shapes the colonies. When European countries began colonizing, many believed that Africans would soon be buying European goods in great quantities. They were wrong. Few Africans bought European goods. However, European businesses still needed raw materials from Africa. The major source of great wealth in Africa proved to be the continent's rich mineral resources. The Belgian Congo contained untold wealth in copper and tin, and even these riches seemed small compared with what gold and diamonds in South Africa could provide. Businesses eventually developed cash crop plantations to grow peanuts, palm oil, cocoa, and rubber, and these products displaced the food crops grown by farmers to feed their families. 3 groups clash over South Africa. So South Africa demonstrated the impact that Europeans had on African peoples. The history of South Africa is a history of Africans, Dutch, and British clashing over land and resources. Although the African lands seemed empty to the Europeans, various ethnic groups had competing claims over huge areas. The local control of these lands, especially in the east, had been in dispute for about 100 years. The Zulus fight the British. From the late 1700s to the late 1800s, a series of local wars shook southern Africa. Around 1816, a Zulu chief, Shaka, used highly disciplined warriors and good military organization to create a large centralized state. Shaka's successors, however, were unable to keep the kingdom together against the superior arms of the British invaders. So in 1879, after Zulu king Cashwell refused to dismiss his army and accept British rule, the British invaded the Zulu nation. Although the Zulus used spears and shields against British guns, they nearly defeated the great European army. And in July of 1879, however, the Zulus lost the Battle of Ulundi and their kingdom, so the Zulu nation fell to British control under 1887. Boers and the British settle in the Cape. The first Europeans to settle in South Africa had been the Dutch, but the Dutch came to the Cape of Good Hope in 1652 and to establish a way station for their ships sailing between Dutch East Indies and the Netherlands. Dutch settlers, known as Boers, gradually took Africans' land and established large farms. The Boers, also known as Afrikaners, and when the British took over the Cape Colony permanently in the early 1800s, they and the Boers clashed over the British policy regarding land and slaves. So in a sense, what happens next is that in the 1830s, to escape the British, several thousand Boers began to move north. This movement has become known as the Great Trek. The Boers soon found themselves fighting fiercely with Zulu and other African groups whose land they were taking. The Boer War. Diamonds and gold were discovered in southern Africa in the 1860s and 1880s, and suddenly adventurers from all parts of the world rushed in to make their fortunes. The Boers tried to keep these outsiders from gaining political rights, and an attempt to start a rebellion against the Boers failed. So the Boers claimed the British and in 1899 took up arms against them. In many ways, the Boer War, also known as the South African War between the British and the Boers, was the first modern total war. The Boers launched commando raids and used guerrilla tactics against the British, and the British countered by burning Boer farms and imprisoning women and children in disease-ridden concentration camps. Black South Africans were also involved in the war. Some fought, others served as scouts, guards, drivers, and workers, and many black South Africans were captured by British and placed in concentration camps, where over 14,000 died. Britain finally won the war, and in 1910, the Boer republics were joined into a self-governing Union of South Africa, which was controlled by the British. The establishing of the colonies signaled a change in the way of life of the Africans, and the Europeans made efforts to change the political, social, and economic lives of the peoples they conquered. We will learn about these changes in Section 2. So as you guys can see, the whole purpose of this reading, of this particular section of the text, was to teach you and to show you just how the Scramble for Africa unfolded in Africa. And in many ways, when we look at this map here, which you'll of course map out yourselves, and this of course designates the European land holdings in Africa, you can clearly see who got what and in how much of a capacity. And so when we look at these European superpowers taking over parts of Africa, we begin to understand more about the history that impacted the continent as a whole. Keep this in mind though. The pros and cons of colonization would later have long-standing impacts over Africa for many years, which in many ways defines Africa still to this day. Thank you very much for tuning in, and remember you can replay any part of this presentation that you need while you finish answering the rest of the key concept questions. Good luck in completing the rest of the lesson.